Greetings and welcome to our monthly Hungry for History program. I'm Luciana Spraker with the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives. This month, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Dave Rossell to share the history of the Pine Gardens neighborhood on Savannah's East Side. This program is the direct result of a request from one of our citizens, and I encourage you to provide feedback on this program, as well as ideas for future programs and speakers by emailing us at archives@savannahga.gov. You can also watch previous Hungry for History programs by visiting our website at savannahga.gov/educational resources. Before we dive into Pine Gardens, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dave Rossell is a professor of architectural history at the Savannah College of Art and Design, where he has taught since 1997. He co-directed the 2007 Vernacular Architecture Forum meeting called Savannah and the Lowcountry. Dr. Rossell co-edited Commemoration in America, Essays on Monuments, Memorialization, and Memory, published by the University of Virginia Press in 2013. He also co-wrote Buildings of Savannah, also published by the University of Virginia Press in 2016. He is a resident of the Avondale neighborhood in Savannah. And now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Dave Rossell. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Rossell. I'm a professor of architectural history at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I'd like to thank Luciana Spraker for her inviting me to speak today in this Hungry for History lecture series. What a great title. I'm very admiring of everything Luciana does with the City of Savannah Archives. My topic today is Pine Gardens, located generally where Pennsylvania Avenue meets President Street Extension on the east side of Savannah. I came to this topic through the tremendous community spirit of longtime Pine Gardens residents, Charles Varner, and particularly Patricia Jenkins, who shared their research and enthusiasm for the neighborhood with me. I was able, with their help and the help of a number of other residents and students, to write a successful National Register nomination for the neighborhood in 2014. Today, Pine Gardens is one of the historic districts that makes Savannah so special. I'm going to now share the screen and have some images to go along with my presentation. The Second World War spurred an unprecedented growth of defense industry and housing across the United States and entirely changed the dynamics of neighborhood development on the east side of Savannah. Having declared a national emergency on September 8th, 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared September 26, 1941 as Liberty Fleet Day and noted it as a memorable day in the history of American shipbuilding, a memorable day in the emergency defense of the nation, and he called out the launching of the first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, as one of our answers to the aggressors who would strike at our liberty. He also noted, while we're proud of what we're doing, this is certainly no time to be content. We must build more cargo ships and still more cargo ships, and we must speed the program until we achieve a launching each day, then 2 ships a day. Savannah Shipyards Incorporated, headed by Frank Cohen, had already contracted with the Savannah Port Authority in April 1941 and began construction in May on what was planned to be a 10-way shipyard, which means a yard with 10 slipways or ramps with scaffolds where ships were constructed. This was located just east of the historic district. And you see on the screen in front of you the plan of the city of Savannah at the top right with the Savannah River coming down. And at the bottom left, generally where this photograph comes in, is the location of the shipyards. In November, the United States Maritime Commission contracted Savannah Shipyards to construct 12 Liberty ships for $1.5 million apiece, but required it to complete its facilities in 60 days, recruit a full staff, and show a working capital of $750,000 in 30 days. Failure to fulfill that contract adequately, combined with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and the subsequent American declaration of war, resulted in the Maritime Commission taking over the yard on January 3rd, 1942. William H. Smith, former executive officer of Todd Shipbuilding Corporation, the leading shipbuilding firm in the country, formed a new company, Southeastern Shipbuilding Corporation, SSC, to manage the yard, now 6 slipways large. Altogether, the site covered 96 acres and held 65 buildings with more than 500,000 square feet of floor space. Some 8 miles of railroad track served 5 locomotives and 69 flat cars. There were 13 gantry cranes capable of lifting 70 tons and 21 locomotive cranes. The management contract obligated SSC to manufacture various shipping vessels, including 36 Liberty ships by 1943, as well as to engage in real estate ventures as needed to supply housing for the yard's employees. From early 1942 until late 1945, SSC operated as one of only 18 Liberty ship manufacturers in the nation. They constructed and launched 106 vessels, including 88 Liberty ships. Each ship was roughly 441 feet long and 56 feet wide, weighed 10,000 tons, and could carry 6,000 tons of cargo or the contents of 300 railroad cars, as well as troops to support U.S. and Allied forces. The first Liberty ship built in Savannah was the SS James Oglethorpe on November 20th, 1940. And the last was the SS Thomas W. Murray on September 15th, 1945. SSC Liberty ship names honored famous American politicians, professionals, and men of letters, emphasizing Georgians. The ship's construction testified to the hard work, talent, and ingenuity of a massive workforce. During its time in Savannah, SSC employed a total of 46,766 workers, with as many as 15,000 working at any one time, of whom 3,500 were women. With each ship requiring some 700,000 hours of labor, the SSC adopted 3 shifts in 1943. 54-hour weeks of 9-hour days, Monday through Saturday, became standard in 1944. This was the largest industrial enterprise in Savannah, and it has never been surpassed. The scale and intensity of the demand created several unusual workplace demographics. First, individuals of every age, background, skill, or lack of skill were enlisted here, even if they couldn't be in the regular armed forces. One drill press operator was 80 years old. One 4'7" man who was rejected as a tail gunner found himself an able welder. An entire family of 33 members and 4 surnames came from upstate New York. African Americans were welcomed, but denied equality in work, blocked from any opportunity for training or advancement, and were restricted in housing, despite laws mandating fair treatment. You see some African Americans here in a segregated photo as stickmen, relegated to picking up trash. As Tony Cope, the historian of the Savannah Liberty ship, has noted, women, African Americans, Southern white migrants, ex-convicts, teenagers, the elderly, and the physically handicapped all found jobs at the shipyard. Of all the groups, women were the most impressive. First hired to serve in traditional roles as receptionists and secretaries, They quickly showed their willingness and ability to fulfill tasks such as crane operating, pipe fitting, and the single largest and most important category, welding. While Rosie the Riveter was the most famous icon of women's place in the defense industry, in Savannah, as in any place that built Liberty ships, it was Wendy the Welder. Welding replaced riveting for cargo shipbuilding because it was quicker to learn the skill and it used less steel, as much as 600 tons less in a 10,000-ton ship. A typical Liberty ship required over 100 miles of welding and cutting. The SSC Welding School trained 6,000 welders. The war effort permanently changed women's place in the workforce. Whereas in 1940, there were only a few dozen women in production jobs across the nation. By 1943, there were as many as 160,000. While many women returned to traditional domestic occupations after the war, many did not. In 1942, 28% of women 14 years and older were in the labor force. By 1945, this number rose to 37%. By 1946, it declined to 31%. By 1950, it was at 32%. By way of comparison today, 57.1% of women work, forming fully 46.9% of the total workforce. These numbers would never have been achieved without the push of World War II. The massive influx of workers in Savannah mirrored developments occurring in industrial sites across the nation and required an unprecedented housing strategy. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8632, coordinating national defense housing on January 11, 1941. This effectively pulled together all federal housing initiatives dating back to 1937 and enlarged them to include A, planning, construction, or operating defense housing facilities, B, granting loans or subsidies for public housing purposes, C, encouraging or assisting the financing or construction of private housing, and D, conducting surveys or analyses of housing conditions and housing markets. A new executive position oversaw the mandate from a new Division of Defense Housing Coordination in the Office for Emergency Management of the Executive Office of the President. The presence of women in the workforce and whole families on the line presented unique challenges in worker housing, making any barracks-like alternatives untenable and requiring a more traditional domestic relationship. And this brings us to Pine Gardens. Just as the Savannah Shipbuilding Corporation was the premier defense contractor in Savannah, Pine Gardens was the model workers' neighborhood. Savannah Shipyards Incorporated, SSI, purchased 3 tracts of land totaling 105 acres, on which to build 500 homes for workmen as early as May of 1941. Located a third of a mile from the Savannah Shipyards location on the Savannah River, they included Twickenham Annex, containing 25 acres, a portion of the Roland Track, containing about 28 acres, and 52 acres of the Bruton Hill Track. Of these, Twickenham Annex and Bruton Hill were previously subdivided, but were sparsely developed, if at all. SSI stated that its goal was to build a village that will not only be a model for Savannah, but for the entire country. The dominant architectural character of Pine Gardens came from its 500 evenly distributed and largely uniform single-family residences, all of which were either immediately built in 1942 or they were built in identical fashion after an expansion of the community, Pine Gardens Annex, in 1952. Variously referred to as the American small house, minimal traditional, World War II era cottage, Levittown, or Victory Cottage, this wartime tract housing was essentially an early and modest version of the ranch house type, which later developed into the single most popular house type of the post-war era. The exteriors of each small single-story house featured a low-sloping side gabled roof, minimal closed eaves, and either a central entry with projecting gabled porch or a side entry into the gable end with just a decorative roof gable on the front facade. Construction techniques of the period relied heavily on technological advances. The houses featured prefabricated elements for efficient on-site assembly. Each featured wooden balloon frame construction supported on brick piers with ventilated brick skirting. Exterior sheathing featured wood-grained textured asbestos shingles on walls and asphalt shingle roofing. Windows were typically 6/6 sash and featured decorative board shutters. The design of the Pine Gardens houses reflected the economics, material shortages, and technological advances of the era. In order to meet price restrictions and maximize production, square footages and overall scale was reduced from pre-war house types. Efforts to increase spatial efficiency and trim costs eliminated basements, second stories, additional bathrooms, and formal dining rooms. Similarly, cost-cutting measures mandated standardized window and door sizes. All houses had only 4 exterior walls, and plumbing walls were created for ease of construction. Due to economic and design constraints, few exterior customizations were available to the homeowner, and therefore a repetitive rhythm of uniform mass and scale developed within the neighborhood, giving it its character. Individual house types were originally differentiated for unskilled or skilled workers and varied from either a 4 or 5 room version. Here are 2 identical 5-room versions built in the 1953 expansion of the neighborhood. Skilled workers would have a larger house of 5 rooms, which Crowley estimated would cost about $4,000 and rent for $22.87 a month. He also thought it might rise in cost to as high as $4,500 or $5,000, but he estimated that the cost would be carried for less than $30 a month, approximately $28.26. Unskilled workers' homes of 4 rooms would cost from $3,000 to $3,500, resulting in payments of approximately $20.18 a month. All rents would include principal, interest, and insurance. The standard plan would include a living room, an eat-in kitchen, bathroom, and 1 or 2 bedrooms. There are slight variations within the massing and plan that can be categorized into types and subtypes. In terms of community planning and development, Pine Gardens was the premier working-class neighborhood of its sort in Savannah. It featured spacious individual lots, a cohesive but varied settlement pattern, and an integral incorporation of a shopping plaza as well as a fire station. Each well-appointed and attractive house sat at the center of the lot with generous setbacks on all sides for plantings. Rear service lanes or alleys were used in the Pine Garden Annex, but were not part of Pine Gardens. Planners avoided the potential for monotony in such a large neighborhood built in one campaign on such a tight budget. With considerable diversity in distributing different house types, varying decorative and functional features related to those house types, and by changing the setbacks. The inclusion of an automobile shopping plaza was a first in Savannah. This was also an early example of such suburban package development in the nation as a whole. It's notable that the anchor tenant, Colonial Stores, was a chain, reflecting the increased uniformity of place to place that the very nature of packaged suburb or uniform houses reflects. And remember, uniformity was seen as a good thing, assuring a standard that could be expected. In lieu of the neighborhood school that had originally been envisioned, neighborhood children in Pine Gardens and adjacent neighborhoods attended the Morse Avenue Elementary School in the Gordonston Street suburb established in 1927. Designed in 1942 in the colonial revival style by the Savannah firm of Levy and Clark, the two-story brick building included 16 classrooms, administrative offices, assembly room, library, kitchen, and cafeteria. A newspaper article reported, "The new school is being built by the government as part of the defense program to take care of the added burden on the Chatham County school system, occasioned by the influx of families of military and defense project workers." In 1949, Cletus Bergen designed the Pennsylvania Avenue Elementary School on the north side of James Street, now Elgin. And I believe that this site is the one that is where the building is located that would have been where this talk was to have taken place if it had not been altered by the coronavirus epidemic. The 1950s brought expansion to Pine Gardens with 5 blocks of new housing annexed to the neighborhood in the east. This was anchored by Eli Whitney Elementary School, opened in September 1953, and the adjacent Riverside Baptist Church opened the same month and year. While the SSC facilitated the construction of Pine Gardens through Pine Gardens Incorporated, and it was meant to be permanent, the Housing Authority of Savannah also erected 3 nearby temporary apartment complexes for workers. Moses Rogers Grove is shown in red with 150 units, and Josiah Tatnall Homes is outlined in black, but it goes off the photograph, which had 750 units. Both were available for occupancy in January 1943. Deptford Place is shown outlined in blue with 850 units, and it opened in June 1943 and was fully completed in September 1943. None of these exist any longer. Moses Rogers Grove sat on the north side of President Street and consisted of 2-story balloon frame apartment buildings arranged around a U-shaped courtyard. Josiah Tatnall Homes, later Savannah Gardens, and then Strathmore Estates, sat south of Pine Gardens and consisted of 1-story balloon frame duplex and quadruplex apartments. Deptford Place adjoined Tatnall Homes on the east and consisted of single-story cinder block row houses. The SSC's company paper, The Southeaster, expressed the urgent need for such smaller, inexpensive housing, saying, "The applications are being filled in the order of their necessity, with the families now living under desperate conditions being attended to first." Another brief advertisement in the want-ad section noted room to rent to man on second shift, suggesting some doubling up of housing. Such multi-unit housing was, of course, not new in Savannah or in the United States in general, but it was often used in the form of tenements or worker housing. Whereas some investment had been made by philanthropists showing the benefits of such housing for people of modest means, their impact remained limited. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, began in 1934 And the agency's rental house division, RHD, began in 1935 to seek some way to address the fundamental need of good quality housing for people of moderate income. Emphasis on carefully thought out site plans, apartment layouts, construction, appearance, and amenities led to the development of the Garden Apartment Complex, to which all of these complexes owed a debt. Overall, Savannah's defense housing reflected the highest ideals of the war effort. The quality of the housing took center stage in the morale-building company literature produced by the Southeastern Shipyard. A two-page spread, shipbuilders like Tatnall Homes, published in the Southeaster of April 15, 1943, presented a collage of images showing the wartime household of Mr. and Mrs. White and J.B. Patterson, housemates at 2415 East Jones Street. Detailed shots showed the lady of the house alternately sprucing herself up at a stylish vanity in her bedroom or drying dishes in the well-appointed kitchen. The men of the house were shown enjoying a snack before dinner, some family conversation, or petting two bird dogs on the front porch. The images indicate some privation with the unusual shared household, but primarily highlights positive moral and patriotic accommodation. Chester White commented that it was one of the most comfortable places I've ever lived, suggesting the benefits of stable domestic life that would support his being a productive defense worker. Quite literally, the modern conveniences of such a home both allowed increased outside work by many women, but at the same time required the workplace commitment of the entire family, or even extended family, to maintain. Savannah's defense housing subdivisions were like training grounds in the latest standards of the fully modern household. Pine Gardens, the only housing meant to be permanent, reflected a particularly finished product in which to entice and engage a willing workforce. In sum, Savannah's Pine Gardens was a place of distinction, albeit an ordinary or regular distinction, as shown through its modern historicist structures on open lots. The most significant person who lived there was just another hard-working woman, albeit now a full-fledged member of the nation's workforce. The automobile shopping plaza was of a sort that we know so well today, we hardly think of them as having a history. Such is the stuff of ordinary distinction. These unassuming attributes gave the neighborhood distinction and helped establish a paradigm of mass-produced normality that would spread from one prepackaged suburb to another as the century continued. Thank you very much. I appreciate your listening to this, and I hope you enjoyed it.